All right, let's jump straight into this explainer and look at the actual man behind the myth. And to do that, well, we have to start with a highly suspicious, completely bald, middle-aged guy. Picture this. It's November 3, 1966. He's just stepped off a plane in La Paz, Bolivia, wearing thick glasses and a sharp suit, holding onto a Uruguayan passport with the name Adolfo Mina Gonzalez. But here's the kicker. The passport is a total fake. The man holding it, he doesn't even exist.
So you gotta ask yourself, who is actually hiding behind that disguise? Well, beneath the fake bald cap and those thick glasses was Ernesto Che Guevara. At that time, he was arguably the most wanted revolutionary on the entire planet. Now today, you probably know him from the most famous, heavily reproduced photograph in human history, right? That iconic stare printed on literally millions of t-shirts all over the globe. But how did this massive global icon end up sneaking into Bolivia in a goofy disguise? To figure that out, we need to strip away all the pop culture myth and look at the raw facts of his life. To get there, let's flash back to 1928 Argentina. Now, unlike the typical trope of a revolutionary born into just crushing poverty, young Ernesto was actually born into an aristocratic, wealthy family. He had absolute financial stability, a totally clear path to medical school, and vast access to complex literature, guys like Marx and Nietzsche. But this comfortable, sheltered upbringing really clashed with a harsh physical reality. He suffered from crippling chronic asthma. And this intense physical suffering definitely shaped his early resilience. But at the end of the day, he was still fundamentally living inside a very comfortable bubble.
Well, that comfortable bubble violently burst during his famous motorcycle journey. In his early 20s, he decided to take a break from medical school and embarked on a trip across Latin America on a motorcycle he nicknamed La Poderosa. And this wasn't just some fun road trip, it was a radical awakening. Over several months, he witnessed the kind of severe poverty that he had only ever read about in his books. We're talking indigenous workers ruthlessly exploited in Chile's massive copper mines, people living completely marginalized in an impoverished leper colony on the banks of the Amazon in Peru, and finally, the extreme, just glaring inequality in oil-rich Venezuela. This journey completely shattered his worldview. He came to the conclusion that the entire continent shared the exact same pain of exploitation.
But the real catalyst for his radicalization, it basically comes down to one staggering number: 70%. When Guevara traveled to Guatemala in the early 1950s, he witnessed the operations of the United Fruit Company. This was a massive U.S. corporation that essentially functioned as a state within a state. They owned a staggering 70% of Guatemala's land. So when the democratically elected Guatemalan president tried to redistribute just some of that land to poor farmers, the U.S. backed a military coup and overthrew him. For Ernesto, this was it, the point of no return. He lost absolutely all faith in peaceful democratic reform. The thoughtful young medical student died right there in Guatemala, and the uncompromising revolutionary was born.
Fleeing all that violence in Guatemala, he eventually ended up in Mexico City. And it was there, hanging out in underground cafes, that he met a group of exiled Cuban rebels. Among them, two brothers named Fidel and Raul Castro. They were actively planning an armed uprising to overthrow the U.S.-backed dictator of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista. The Cubans very quickly noticed this Argentine doctor's intense, almost obsessive dedication, and they started calling him Che. It's basically an Argentine slang term meaning, hey you or friend, and that simple nickname stuck forever. It officially marked his transformation into a full-fledged guerrilla fighter.
Now, the path to victory in Cuba was anything but smooth. Honestly, it was brutally violent. Their campaign started with an absolute disaster in 1956. Their boat, the Granma, landed in Cuba and they were immediately ambushed. Out of 80 men, only about 20 even survived. They were forced to retreat deep into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. But it was here that Che really proved his lethal effectiveness. He became a master of ruthless guerrilla warfare. He strictly enforced discipline and didn't hesitate to execute suspected informants. This unrelenting, hardcore strategy ultimately led to him commanding the decisive capture of the heavily fortified city of Santa Clara, completely breaking the back of the regime.
And you have to understand, the sheer unbelievable scale of this underdog victory is just staggering. On one side, you've got Batista's heavily armed, professionally trained army of over 10,000 soldiers. On the other side, Che and Fidel were leading a core force of roughly 300 to 400 combatants. It sounds impossible, right? Yet, through superior guerrilla tactics, deep support from the local peasant population, and just pure audacity, they miraculously toppled the government in 1959. So almost overnight, Che Guevara becomes the second most powerful man in a newly formed state.
However, actually holding power is very different from fighting for it, and victory brought a pretty deep ideological split between the leaders. Fidel Castro operated with pragmatism. Facing a crushing embargo and surviving over 600 assassination attempts orchestrated by the US, Castro knew the Cuban state desperately needed a powerful ally to survive, so he leaned heavily on the Soviet Union. Che, on the other hand, was driven by pure, strict idealism. He demanded total independence for the developing world and vehemently rejected intervention from both the USA and the USSR. He even publicly criticized the Soviets, which, as you can imagine, made his position in Cuba increasingly untenable.
So Che's extreme, uncompromising dedication led him to do something almost unprecedented in modern history. He voluntarily walked away from absolute power. In April 1965, he wrote a sudden, completely secret resignation letter to Fidel Castro. Reading from it, he stated, "I formally resign my positions in the leadership of the party, my post as minister, my rank of major, and my Cuban citizenship." And then, he just vanished. He vanished so completely that the CIA initially assumed Castro had him killed, but Che hadn't been purged. Actually, he had simply left to try and ignite a massive global revolution.
His very first stop was the Congo in Central Africa. But, spoiler alert, his 7-month campaign there was a catastrophic failure. He arrived really hoping to replicate the Cuban guerrilla model, but instead he found disorganized rebel factions that were deeply, deeply divided. And to his absolute dismay, local fighters often relied on magic potions they honestly believed would make them bulletproof. For a hyper-rational, militant guy like Che, he just couldn't work with that. The whole thing played out exactly as the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser had warned him beforehand, when he cautioned Che against going to Africa and ending up playing Tarzan.
And this trail of disasters brings us right back to where we started at the beginning of this explainer, that disguised man sneaking into Bolivia in 1966. Che aimed to spark a brand new revolution right in the heart of South America, but instead, he walked straight into a deadly trap. His plans were utterly destroyed by just a cascade of disasters. The CIA was aggressively training the Bolivian army specifically to hunt him down. On top of that, his crippling childhood asthma returned in the humid jungle, and he had absolutely no medicine. His tiny band of fighters faced severe starvation. But the most devastating blow of all? The local peasants, literally the very people he had come to fight for, were terrified of his foreign guerrilla group, and they repeatedly betrayed their locations to the military.
Eventually, they were cornered in a narrow, desolate ravine on October 8, 1967. His forces were completely wiped out. Wounded in the leg and with his gun jammed, Che was captured. Yet he remained fiercely defiant to the very end. The very next day, a terrified, hesitant young Bolivian soldier entered the rural schoolhouse where he was being held to execute him. Che looked right at him and delivered these final words. "I know you are here to kill me. Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man."
He was executed right then and there with 9 bullets. He was dead at the shockingly young age of just 39. Now, the Bolivian government and the CIA truly believed that by killing the man, they had permanently extinguished the threat of his ideology. But here's the ironic part. In ending the life of the man, they inadvertently and almost instantly cemented a monumental myth.
See, the Bolivian military's public relations strategy completely backfired on them. They washed his body, laid it out on a hospital laundry sink, and invited photographers in to document his corpse. It was supposed to be a public display meant to prove a crushing, pathetic defeat, but instead, it created this unintended martyrdom. Locals and journalists alike looked at his emaciated body, his long hair, and his strangely peaceful, open-eyed expression, and they immediately started drawing comparisons to Jesus Christ. The photos that were intended to show a defeated dead rebel instead broadcast the image of a modern-day martyr to the entire world.
The stark reality of his life is heavily, heavily documented. We know he utilized undeniably brutal, violent methods. We know many of his geopolitical campaigns, like in the Congo and Bolivia, were just staggering military failures. And the economic realities of the systems he championed, still deeply controversial today. Yet, his face is absolutely everywhere. So why is that? Well, perhaps it's because, in a world full of compromises, Che Guevara represents the absolute extreme of conviction. He's that rare historical figure who possessed immense power, wealth, and status, and willingly threw every bit of it away to die in a muddy ravine for his beliefs. So I'll leave you with this to think about. When people wear his image today, are they celebrating the flawed, violent reality of the actual man, or are they simply holding on to the intoxicating idea of absolute, uncompromising rebellion?